Hey guys, sorry about the poor quality audio here at the intro. It is not part of the interviews. It gets better, I'm telling you, it does. Welcome to episode 135. Joining me today, sociologist and psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Metzl of Vanderbilt University, and as always, because it's Friday, comedian Christian Finnegan. I'm Pete Dominick, and it's time to stand up with me right now. Hey friends, I'm recording this on my deck because my studio is fakakta. I've caught a firefly right here, and I'm videotaping it as well, so you can see it if you want to watch it. If you're a subscriber on Patreon, you can watch me open today's show on video. Anyway, hopefully you saw that. He just flew away. He's coming back. Thank you very much for joining me today. I have an awesome show coming your way with Dr. Jonathan Metzl of Vanderbilt University, who wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness, which is really good, as well as comedian Christian Finnegan, like I just said. And I had a really challenging thing happen today. I had a technical issue, a problem today while I was moderating a panel, which I was really excited to be. Oh, there's Indy. You can see the dog if you're watching. I was really excited to be invited to moderate this panel, which was about how to be a better ally as a white person. And I was excited to be asked, and I really prepared for it, thanks to my friend Danielle Moody, who asked me to do it. But it was a panel of white people talking about how we can be better, how we can do better to fight racism within our homes, our communities, our workplaces, etc. And you can see it online. I'll share it in the show notes on the links. But basically what happened was I pride myself on being technically good at these things and ready and prepared. We signed up. We all connected at 3:30. It was supposed to start live at 4 o'clock. It was a big deal. It was sponsored by a bank and a company and Berkshire Bank and this company, Revex, as well as the Griot, which is an awesome online magazine targeted towards black folks. And I was psyched to be a part of it, and guess what? My whole studio overheated because I don't have any air conditioning in the studio, which is why I'm outside tonight for this podcast, and it might not sound perfectly here at the opening, but at least you can see out on the deck, which is really peaceful, where you've got fireflies. Fireflies or lightning bugs, folks? You tell me. Anyway, I don't want to talk long because I don't know how good the audio is, and I want to get to my first guest right away here, but it sucked. I was sitting there just about ready to go, and my whole computer just froze. And I realized it's because everything was too hot. So I'm moving out to the shed. I'm going to renovate my shed into a studio, and I'm really excited to have your help on it. I feel like this show is an awesome community of people who are constantly sharing ideas and now talking to each other, and certainly helping me out. And when you help me out, you help other people out in a way, because I share all those ideas and all those people and those resources. But I guess this is selfish because you're helping me build the studio. But anybody who wants to, that has carpentry skills or technical skills or interior design that wants to help me, I'd love to have your help. Maybe we could just have a party and we'll just hang out and build it together. So anybody who has any of those skills, that's what I want to have to do. It's going to take probably the next 6 to 8 weeks if I can make it work. In the meantime, I'll make this work one way or another every day because it has to. So whether I bake in the studio or set up somewhere else in the house, we'll keep doing it every day, and I appreciate your support. So if you've subscribed already, thank you very much. If you haven't, please consider it. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick, or just click on the paid subscription on the show notes. So my first guest is Dr. Jonathan Metzl. He's like I said, a sociologist and psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University. He's written several books, but his new book is called Dying of Whiteness. And oh my gosh, is it really important. He did a ton of research for the book. He interviewed a ton of people in Tennessee and Kansas and in Missouri. And it's such an important book, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. It's really the proof of the idea that a lot of liberal hacks like me say that you're voting against your own interests. And you'll hear me say that line again in the interview. So thanks for checking me out today. Thanks for listening to the podcast. I think you're going to learn a lot from this conversation. And then I also have a great conversation coming up, of course, with Christian Finnegan. Let's go to Jonathan Metzl of Vanderbilt right now. So I'm really excited to have him now, Dr. Jonathan Metzl. It is great to get you on the podcast for the first time, and I'm only sorry I didn't get you when the hardcover first came out of Dying of Whiteness. The paperback is now available, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. I'm so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me, sir.
Great. I'm really honored to speak with you today.
So you're a psychiatrist and a sociologist. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I had a kind of long, involved training where nobody quite knew where I was going to end up, but it turned out mushed them all together. So I'm a sociologist, a psychiatrist, and I direct a center at Vanderbilt called Medicine, Health, and Society.
So when did you start to approach, study, think about, talk about, and write about racial differences in America? That's what I'm going to call them before we get to more specific.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's actually something that was part of my joint training. So I've been working on various aspects of race and gender in America, really for much of my career. The first big book project that I did was about gender in the pharmaceutical industry. Then I had another big project that came out in 2010 called the Protest Psychosis, which was a story about how African-American men who were protesting in the 60s and 70s got locked into mental hospitals for protesting. And then had this book, Dying of Whiteness, that came out, as you were saying, about a year ago, that looks at whiteness in America. So it's been a pretty good 20 years here.
It is fascinating, your scholarship, your experience, your writing. I'm so excited learning about your work and honored to be in this conversation with you, because I think that your work is so important for so many different reasons. And obviously you have all the credibility here, not only in your expertise, but you grew up in a lot of the states that you're talking about in your new book, and you live and work, of course, in Tennessee at Vanderbilt. But this book in particular is the issue I want to talk to you about today, Dying of Whiteness, is so relevant for so many different reasons. But how did you report this? Because, you're a professor, but you went and talked to people and interviewed people. Talk to me a little bit about how you actually conducted the research for this book.
Well, that's exactly right. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri. I live in Nashville. And so this was kind of my home turf. But the people I wrote about are people I know, people I grew up with. It wasn't a huge stretch. It wasn't like I was flying into some alien country or something like that. And I'd say that there are two impetuses for me. First, actually, was much before the research, but the Kansas City, Missouri that I grew up in was one where, certainly there were a lot of problems of every kind, but also I grew up seeing people kind of get along. And when you grew up in Kansas City, we had friends who were from every possible background, and some people were conservative, some people were liberal, some people were pro or anti different things, and just there were ways in the Kansas City that I grew up in that people made things work. And what happened was, with the advent of different kinds of politics that came about with the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus and the NRA and all these kind of things, I just saw firsthand in my Kansas City how those politics started making people resent each other, fear each other, very racialized stories about how, immigrants are going to come take away your stuff, or you need a gun because somebody's going to come carjack you. And it really led to the breakdown of kind of civic engagement in Kansas City. And so part of why I did this was to say that I've seen America do a lot better. I've seen the Midwest do a lot better. I've even seen red states do a lot better. And then the other part is that the real research for this book came about because I was doing a project about the Affordable Care Act in Tennessee and interviewing a lot of very medically ill men who would have really benefited from the Affordable Care Act, but they kept rejecting healthcare, even though it would have literally extended their own lives because of very racialized reasons. I'll never forget interviewing people who were almost on death's doorstep. And they said, I'm not signing up for this, even if it's going to help me, because, to quote one of the subjects, I don't want to be part of a program that's going to benefit Mexicans and welfare queens, is what he told me. And so this idea that basically...
Mexicans and who? I'm sorry, that cut.
And welfare queens, right? So right. Black and brown people, basically.
Right.
And so basically the story he told me was just one about how, man, I'm just hanging on by a thread. But to be white in America means I'm not going to sign up for a program that's going to benefit other people. And I just kept thinking, it wasn't like, oh, you idiot. Partially, but it was also how sad that that's what it means to be white, is that you're not going to join a program that benefits everybody.
Yeah, it's
It is. It really is sad. It's easy to call people names and call people idiots and stupid and ignorant, but it's harder to dig into it and try to understand where all of the ignorance comes from. And you do such a good job in this book and in your work and your career. What is whiteness?
Well, I'm clear in my work that I'm not saying that whiteness is one thing. It's not a biological category. It's not a genetic category. There are certainly different ways to be white in America. Unfortunately, the dominant one politically right now is that this idea of white is this kind of being a part of this imagined hierarchy, atop of the hierarchy, and that position is being threatened by immigrants and minorities and multiculturalism and all these kind of things. And so this idea that basically to be white is to have to maintain some kind of social pressure. And so in the book, I talk to many other people who don't adhere to that, who are appalled by President Trump's version of whiteness. And part of the argument I make in the book is that it's true that whiteness doesn't mean one thing, but because of that, it's incumbent on white Americans to articulate a different version of whiteness, to speak out and basically say, yeah, this doesn't stand for me, but here's another version of whiteness that's based in generosity or community or anti-racism, all these other factors. And so in a way, it's kind of like, why did this one version of whiteness, this version that's based in resentment, why did that come to dominate our politics in our country right now?
Dr. Metzel, I think that the resentment is part of the strategy for politicians and for media. I've always thought this. Politicians use resentment to divide us, to get elected. And more importantly, I think media leads them, in my opinion. Media is much more pernicious, pervasive, and dangerous and effective, I think, than the politicians themselves. And I'm not sure who you think follows who, but I always think that the politicians, especially on the right, follow the conservative media, because I think conservative media is a lot more powerful than whatever we describe as liberal media. And so the media uses resentment and divisiveness to drive ratings. I mean, I've been working at MSNBC and CNN for years, and the best way to get a segment, to get eyeballs on the segment, to keep the ratings high, to sell advertising, is to create a conflict. But that's kind of artificial. There's a lot more that we have in common than we do in conflict. And so how accurate is just this idea? You're the scholar. I'm the liberal talk radio hack, that politics of resentment helps get you elected and helps get you ratings. That's been my saying for a while.
That was one of the great frustrations. It's why I like writing books more than sending tweets, to be honest, because I met people and it's funny, but I did research for 5 years for this book, and about 80% of the people I met were just trying to get by, right? And they probably were people who would send some obnoxious tweet, some hateful tweet. But when I would I spent a lot of time in very pro-gun communities in red states. I spent time going on open carry marches and stuff like that. And I don't know, people are complicated, right? I mean, people are really complicated, and there's a whole spectrum of different kinds of opinions, ways to whatever. And in the book I write, some people were appalled by the prison pipeline that was being created for young Black Americans in their community. Some people were saying, we need to. I mean, people were telling me all kinds of things, and it was in the middle of red states. People would say, I just read this Ibram Kendi book, and it's really changed me. Really surprising stuff. And I wrote about all that stuff in the book. But then there were also people who just said horrible, horrible racist things, and I just kept thinking, these are the stories that if it was just Twitter, these are the only ones that would get retweeted 1,000 times. These are the only ones that would get on the media, because in a way, what you do is you pick the most extreme example and then you suggest that stands in for everybody. And what that means is that people lose the ability to talk to each other. And that's the idea, right? That's the whole idea. President Trump wants us to think we have nothing in common with each other. As a way of polarizing, but a lot of people make money off that polarization. Media companies do, Twitter does. We're almost in a way set against each other in ways that make our problems seem impossible when they're not.
Yeah, that's also probably in social media, especially on Facebook, I think what drives the algorithms too, the divisiveness. And yeah, that's really, really well said, really well explained how it works.
But the point is, if you think about it, and this is part I write about in the book. If you just look at it from an economic or health perspective or other kinds of perspectives, like a poor white person and a poor Latinx person and a poor African American person living in Tennessee have much more in common than they do with a wealthy person like Trump from New York, much more. And so the whole idea is, how can you get those three groups of people to not mobilize together? Because the minute they realize they have common cause, then they can advocate for a bunch of different things like better wages or healthcare, all these kind of things. And so racism is used to divide people against really their common interests. Because if you just look at it from Affordable Care Act is a great example. States that got the Affordable Care Act and expanded Medicaid, everybody did better. Minoritized populations did better, and white people did better. And states that blocked Medicaid extension, well, it was terrible for Black and brown people. But in the book I show, actually, the most devastating effect was for white people. And so there's so much work that's being done to try to get people to not realize how much they have in common, right? And that's where all these scripts are so pernicious, because the minute Black and brown and white people, for example, would get together in a state like Tennessee and say, give us health care, the GOP all of a sudden can't pay for tax cuts for wealthy people. It's its core issue. And so in a way, this is a conscious strategy, and it's one that's effective because we don't have effective strategies really for being anti-racist as a society.
I am so glad that you called it scripts. I'm going to steal that. You said this is where so many of these scripts are so pernicious, because language is so important, and linguists from Noam Chomsky to George Lakoff on the left, and even though he's not a linguist, but
Frank Luntz on the right,
all of these slogans and these scripts, as you will, as you talk about, and they're effective. And the government takeover of healthcare was so effective. But I feel like, getting back to the book, that what I've been saying, and so many, again, kind of liberal radio, hacks, if you will, because we overuse this phrase, is you're voting against your own. They're voting against their own interests. And the book you wrote talks about those interests: healthcare, education, and obviously work, occupation, and many others. Specifically, you're an expert on gun violence and how the gun laws, they have these scripts that make you think that you're going to be attacked and invaded at any point. So you go to get a gun, and then somebody ends up killing themselves with it, or an accident. The point being, they're voting against their own interests. What do you think of that phrase? I've been told it's not very effective.
Well, it's not effective as convincing anyone. But I will say that, that's kind of the central story of the book is, are they voting against their own interests? So part of the argument is that they're being told and deciding, really ultimately, that voting for whiteness is in their interest more than healthcare or education or guns. And so in a way, just the deep inflection of racism, the deep penetration of racism in this country makes people think that they've got to hold on to this castle. I'm using castle because of the castle doctrine in gun policy, for example. Right. That basically you have to protect this thing called whiteness, even if it's horrific. And so, in a way, what I argue is the problem isn't education. The problem is how we define whiteness, right? That people are being told that whiteness is something worth dying for, and that's what they're doing. And so, as I show. I just added up in the book how many years of life is whiteness causing the average white person in a red state, and it turns out to be massive numbers of years and dollars lost. And so really, as I argue, and I think you and I are on a panel tomorrow, we'll talk about this more, but really it's the framing of whiteness as being something that is worth not only dying for, but now, as we're seeing, kind of sinking the country for.
But they're not being told that they're defending whiteness literally like that, are they? I mean, there's not language that uses the word whiteness, is there?
No, it's actually the framing of all these issues. Like when I look at guns, for example, in the book I go through years and years of gun advertisements to show how the language of guns is basically, get your white privilege back. I mean, they actually use the word privilege in some of these gun ads. For education, there were all these messages. We need to cut money for schools because, Black districts are taking away your hard-earned tax dollars. So there are all these catchphrases, everyone. They don't come out. Nobody comes out and says whiteness except me. It's more that the language is being used is basically, again and again, this language of you have this privilege and somebody's out there who's undeserving, who's taking it away from you.
I think that in the book, there's tons of research. There's tons of astounding numbers. And you're saying people are literally dying protecting these privileges. But when we think about the role of government and how government spends money, there's always been a difference of opinion on that. And I think in our lifetime, most starkly during the Obama administration, the Tea Party, and what we saw was they were constantly screaming about government spending, specifically the deficit, the budget deficit, and the national debt. It's unsustainable. We can't continue on as a country, and therefore we have to make cuts. We also saw this in Europe called austerity. You write about this, you research this, and you're saying that budget cuts, government spending is out of whack. They're spending on all the wrong things, and they're cutting the spending on the things that literally save people's lives. Tell me about how austerity measures has put people's lives in danger.
Well, in the book, I study the Kansas experiment.
Oh, what a disaster.
Which was really no experiment. Right. Total disaster. And basically, Kansas made the decision that it was going to invest in one resource, which was wealthy people. And so Kansas cut the budgets of schools and roads and bridges and aqueducts and infrastructure and safety and bike lanes and you name it. All that funding went away so that Kansas could give money to rich people and corporations. And the idea was then that money would trickle down to people, which it turned out not to. Surprise.
It wasn't a surprise. Your sarcasm is duly noted, but it wasn't a surprise. We knew this didn't work in the early 80s at the national level. We knew it wouldn't work in Kansas. Go ahead.
No, nobody thought it was going to work in Kansas. And that was the idea, right? The idea. Well, and the idea was basically that what it did is it eviscerated opportunity. It basically undercut. This is Kansas, right? So it basically cut away all the progress that had been made since Brown versus Board of Education in terms of building public school systems for Black and brown communities. It cut that away. But it turned out the budget cuts also cut away all the white school districts as people just needed more and more and more money. And so what happened was this became a complete disaster on many levels. The schools were all downgraded, graduation rates fell, dropout rates rose, and other things started to happen as well. Less money for highway repairs, more traffic accidents. The infrastructure of the state went from an A to a D on national report cards. The whole state started to fall apart. Now, in a normal universe, you would say, well, God, let's not do what Kansas did because it was a disaster. But instead, the Kansas failed experiment became the template for the 2017 GOP tax bill. So then we just brought that experiment to the entire country. And lo and behold, what that did is it made us more vulnerable during this pandemic, right? Because we cut away so much infrastructure. And so again and again and again, we take these messages and then we instead of saying this is a national emergency, which is what I think another system would do, at least right now, the government has been using these horrible examples about education, guns, healthcare, just to double down on these policies that kill people.
Yeah, you mentioned this, that they're scripts, they're slogans, but they aren't effective policies. And I think the truth is, for Republicans and conservatives, it often catches up with them. Unfortunately, it's too late. People have died. They've lost their jobs. It's not too late for those judges that have lifetime tenures or, are permanently on those courts. But what we see is a political swing, and I think we're seeing that in Kansas. I mean, I think that as a result of this, I believe the teachers union gained a lot of momentum and power in Kansas and got a lot of benefits out of it. But the point that I see is that they passed these policies. These policies ravage the communities and states and countries that they're living in. And then often the politics swing back towards a progressive candidate. Not always and not ever in certain states and certain places. People don't realize that. But the point I'm making is that there are just slogans. They are just scripts. There aren't policies that are actually helping people. But at what point, Dr. Metzel, does your research say that it actually changes people's minds in terms of the people they'll vote for and the policies they might now support?
Well, unfortunately, there's not like some wake-up point where Republicans become Democrats. And what I found for the most part was the more desperate people became, the more ideological they became. So, for example, in quote-unquote gun country where I was, there were epidemic rates of gun suicide. People were literally losing their kids to accidental shootings. And what they kept telling me is, this makes us more pro-gun. The liberals aren't going to come take away our guns. So this rhetoric was so powerful about somebody's going to come take away what's yours. And also, people were becoming very desperate. They didn't see that they were becoming desperate because of the policies put in place by the politicians that they elected, but the more desperate they became, and I guess that in a way, in a human way, that makes sense, right? When people get sick, they become more religious. When people are in a pandemic, they become more communal, or I don't know, something. So and even with mask wearing and stuff like that, all these things. So I think, in a way, it's not surprising. The one place I did see some pushback was about schools. So it also related to topics. It wasn't going to happen with healthcare. It wasn't going to happen with guns. But in schools, when people started seeing that their kids' schools were getting cut away, that was the one place. And Kansas is a particular state also. It's a bit more centrist than the other ones I study. But Kansas was a place where when moms started seeing their kids' schools get cut, that was the one place. And a woman said it to me pretty well. She said, we were okay with the fire burning in the field, but when the flames started to seep their way into the mansion, that's when we paid attention. Which is a sad metaphor, but that was kind of what it was. Is that when people saw the effect on their own lives, that's when they changed their mind. But maybe that's what's happening with the pandemic too. We'll have to see what happens with residency.
I guess the test of that would be this pandemic is ravaging our country the worst, and yet I'm not sure that most Americans are clamoring to take the vaccine that comes out. I mean, anecdotally, but we hear the anti-vax movement have gained so much momentum. It's so terrifying that I hear educated, thoughtful people saying, you know what? I don't even get the flu vaccine. I'm definitely not getting this vaccine. They haven't tested it. And it's like, it goes back to that kind of cognitive dissonance that you're talking about with the Kansas austerity measures or anywhere else. You see the result of the horrible policies and you still don't change your mind. What does it take, do you think, if anything, to make people change the way they're thinking and so that they don't die?
Good leadership, number one. Much better leadership. But I mean, the pandemic was a perfect moment. I mean, 5 months ago, nobody in the world had coronavirus and everybody was challenged in the same way. And this was a moment this is a really existential moment. Like, people are literally dying everywhere. And so, the fact that things like masks have become politicized in this particular way just speaks to the fact that the vector of this is not just the virus, it's polarization, right? That the fact that these machines are so adept. But I do think that, I think the vaccine, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's similar to a mask, right? You don't wear a mask to protect yourself, you wear a mask to protect everybody else. And a vaccine the same way, it's not going to work unless we have other people getting on board with this. So it just shows that, we have to have a national referendum on a lot of things, certainly on racism, but also on polarization. I mean, what are the strategies to address this polarization right now? Because if we don't come together, we're in much bigger trouble than we are even right now.
Well, one thing that is definitely changing, obviously, is white folks are looking at themselves and trying to understand where more and more people are understanding the privilege, and more people are understanding the networks that we're in and how they're broken and how we need to open them to all different kinds of people. And so I want to know what you think of the Black Lives Matter, this iteration. It started about 7 years ago, but what is happening right now in the streets of America? And more importantly, to some extent, Black people have always stood up and always protested and often, unfortunately, been brutalized and assassinated for doing that. But now white people really are starting to understand. I think your book and your work is a huge contributor of that. And I'm so happy to have you talking about it. But I didn't think we would see this type of awareness occur. It was just a few years ago that I read a research poll that said 51% of white Americans think they're more discriminated against than white people. Police, think they're the victims. That change in public opinion towards understanding and accepting Black Lives Matter movement is really surprising and I think really important. But how do you see it?
I think it's remarkable. I think it's unprecedented, and I think there were a couple turning moments where people just started to realize, and I think one of them actually had to do with the pandemic. Early in the pandemic, it became pretty clear that Black and brown communities were suffering the brunt of the illness, of the death, for structural reasons, for social reasons. And at that moment, there was a moment in America where we could either say, we're dying as Americans, let's fix these structural inequities, or do what President Trump did and say, I'm not wearing a mask because they're dying. And I think that was a bridge too far for a lot of people, right? To basically say it's never been more clear which lives matter in this country, right? Than it was at that moment when we didn't think of these disparate rates of death in the pandemic as a national emergency to protect our fellow citizens, right? And so I think part of the issue is really real right now. It's a moment of terror for a lot of people. And I certainly think that the racial frame that Trump has put around this has led a lot of people to say, I don't want to be part of it. But I also think it's important to note that in the 7 years since Black Lives Matter started after Ferguson, that a lot of work has been done. It's also the result of a lot of work, a lot of coalition building, a lot of just on the ground messaging and engagement. So I also think it's a testament just to all the work that's been done in that time. And I think that I'm very optimistic going forward. But as you mentioned, also, there are just a lot of conservative judges being put in right now who are going to dictate the ways we engage with each other going forward. And so the protests are incredible, but there's also a lot of really important political stuff about the future of our country and particularly about judiciary appointments that I think needs to be part of this focus as well.
Before I let you go, could I ask you to just share one more anecdote from your book and research? Part 1 is titled Missouri, 2, Tennessee, 3 is titled Kansas. You went to all these states. Of course, you live in Tennessee and talk to people. And before I wrap up, I'd love to hear just one more thing that you learned and wrote about in your book from any of the folks that you talked to in any of those states.
Well, it's funny because in the book, just like on Twitter, like the really problematic stuff that people told me, that's kind of what has gotten the airtime. And it's important to have those stories out in the public, a white person talking to other white people. And I didn't think like, oh, it's me versus them. I thought we're all part of this big frame of whiteness and it's killing all of us. But I would say that the conclusion of my book is the counter narrative, right? The conclusion of my book talks to people like an incredible school board member in Olathe, Kansas, who really was bemoaning the fact that the money was going to her district and not to minoritized districts, and was leading an effort to reallocate some of the funds. I talked to somebody in a gun frauds prevention network who talked about how only white mass shootings were getting the airtime, and that there was tons of black on black mass shootings that nobody ever even looked into or called them psychological. And so the conclusion of the book, which is a much quieter part of the book, talks about how there are examples out there, but because of Twitter, because of Instagram, because of media clips and stuff like that, we never get to engage. And so part of the end of the book was to basically say there are hopefully ways of communicating and re-articulating what it means to be white in this country, but we have to, in a way, not listen to this and sensationalized narratives and figure out ways to talk across these political divides, which hopefully is what's happening with these protests right now.
Your work is really important, courageous, and frankly, easy for someone like me to understand. I couldn't put down this book. Dying of Whiteness, Jonathan Metzl. I'm really looking forward to being on this panel with you, if moderating that panel, and I hope folks will think about joining us. But it's so great to get you on the podcast. This is just the beginning. I hope I can get you back because your work is so important and valuable. Thank you so much for joining me.
Really my honor. Let's keep talking.
All right, that is Jonathan Metzel, Professor Dr. Jonathan Metzel, Dying of Whiteness. Get that book right now. Follow him on Twitter at Jonathan Metzel, Metzl. And I'll get even better audio from him next time. Hopefully that was okay. But this whole show audio quality it's not A+. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to lie. Believe me, it could be better, and it will be when I fix my studio, which should be on the very next episode. Okay, John Metzel's great. I really enjoyed talking to him, and also that panel that we were talking about already occurred, and I told you what a nightmare technically that was. And let's move on, though. However, let's move on, carry on, move forward, plow ahead with comedian Christian Finnegan, who joins me right now. Always love when he is here. We had a great conversation, as we always do. He's on Twitter at Christ Finnegan. Go buy all of his comedy specials. If you haven't, let him know you heard him here. Here it is right now, Christian Finnegan.
All right, well, there he is, ladies and gentlemen. It's Friday, so that means I get to talk to my friend, comedian Christian Finnegan, and we recap the week, whatever stories we were interested in, or we just have a chat, and you guys get to be a part of it. So thank you, as always, Christian, for joining me, and great to see you, pal.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Peter.
Lots to talk about this week with you. So much has happened during this week, but some specific things in kind of the world of comedy that I wanted to discuss with you. and kind of free speech, connecting two stories as well as obviously Primary Day in New York and in Kentucky. So lots to discuss. But let's start with comedians and their terrible, terrible behavior. We learned, I guess it was last week, that a very famous, very successful by any definition of success comedian, Chris D'Elia, D'Elia, forgive me. I guess he's not that famous to me. I've never actually met him. I don't know him.
Neither have I.
Yeah. But he got in, I want to say hot water, but it's worse than that. It doesn't do it justice for being called out for text messaging and communicating and trying to have sex with women who are underage. He's 40, and several women came out and accused him of some pretty inappropriate, potentially illegal things that he could be brought up on charges for. I don't know that will happen. How do you see this? How do you explain this issue and how it maybe, Christian, reflects not obviously specifically on comedians, but just on men behaving terribly?
I mean, it's hard because I've always straddled the club comedy world from the quote unquote alternative comedy world. And, you know, a lot of people that I consider real comedy fans and funny people and people who are fans of humor and whatnot don't go to comedy clubs because there is a vibe that it is dominated by, you know, creeps and scumbags. And, you know, a story like this just sort of underscores what a lot of people feel about the comedy world in general, which is a shame because it certainly is there. It certainly is there. But there's also a lot of really funny, talented people trying to work hard and just trying to get better at their act and whatnot. And, you know, this dude, it's to me, and I'm a bit of an anti-LA guy.
Yeah, me too.
It's so Los Angeles to me, this whole
How
scale.
so?
It just seems that whenever there's, I don't know, man, there's a genre of comedian, these sort of Dane Cook acolytes, you know, the if you want to call him the patient zero of sort of Ed Hardy comedy, you know, of muscly dude with a t-shirt too tight comedy. And they're all, you know, and it's funny because if there's one I've realized in the comedy world, my least favorite people are New York or Jersey types who move to LA. That, you know, the sort of Rogan, Joey Diaz, you know, Chris D'Elia, like that sort of guy who have that sort of Jersey attitude, but they live in LA. So they've got that kind of Sunset Strip bullshit. I don't know the guy personally. It always feels a little weird to jump in when the water is so warm, but I've never been a fan of what he does. And it always, you know, the sort of good looking guy trying to get laid on stage vibe has just always been my least favorite.
Well, not only just the good looking guy, but I've been saying in reference to this situation when people ask me about it, I'm like, well, there's always been a comedian, or there's a lot of guys who get into comedy to get laid, to get women. And sure, it's a great byproduct if you can do it, but it shouldn't be the primary reason. And I think a lot of guys, you know, it's easy to meet people when you do comedy, and it's easier to meet people when you do comedy and you do it well and you come off stage and they all come up to you and say you were great and start talking to you. And it can be a very attractive thing too. It's powerful. You're funny, you're talented, but to have it be the primary reason why you do comedy is an issue. It's seemingly for a lot of comedians, or to say it more simply, a lot of guys perform, they have a great set, they get off stage and they wait like a predator. They just wait. And that's super common, it would seem. They wait by the door, they wait to be seen, and then they try to turn it into something.
And then it's, you know, and it's a little, I roll my eyes at it when it's a dude trying to hook up with 25-year-olds and stuff like that. I mean, that's still a little boring to me, but, you know, at least it's not legally actionable. But when you're talking about a guy who's trying to cultivate a fan base of like 19 and under, like that's who you count as your comedy fans. By the way, there's Chris D'Elia, Justin Bieber's favorite comedian. If that helps at all, he like hangs around with Justin Bieber.
Well, Justin Bieber's a very moral guy. But I mean, it's like son of Jesus, I believe.
But it's like
Christ at the center of his life.
If that's what you're aiming your writing, your joke writing skills on, 17-year-old girls, you know, if that, like, what are you doing? Why even do comedy at that point? Who the fuck cares what a 17-year-old girl thinks is funny? Or boy, by the way. This is an anti-teenager in general policy, not necessarily girls or boys.
What do you think about the consequences or repercussions that have been occurring to him or other comedians as a result of these things being made public, these accusations coming out? His agent fires him, his management fires him, some of the shows he was on get pulled off different networks and so on. I mean, do you think that that's too harsh, not harsh enough? Because we hear so much about this phrase cancel culture, and I'm not sure what people want to be the consequence or reaction when allegations and accusations come out like this. I don't know what they're hoping for, but seemingly, you know, the agents, the managers, and networks, they immediately cut their losses when these things surface. Do you think it's appropriate?
Well, there's a cost-benefit ratio. I mean, you know, if you can't promote a show because it's starring a guy who is known to creep on 16-year-old girls, that's not canceling. That's a business decision. That is it's a rational take on somebody's marketability. And it's, in terms of, you know, cancel culture in general, it's like, well, when women have to deal, especially in comedy, and, you know, since this Crystalia thing popped off last week, a lot of women are coming forward with just little, you know, either microaggressions, little annoying things about, like, you know, MCs saying stuff like, oh, this next comedian's hot, or whatever, as they bring a woman comedian to stage, which, you know, certainly isn't the same as statutory rape, but it is annoying. Two incidences of female comedians talking about club managers propositioning them, or, you know, trading stage time for sexual favors and whatnot. That once you rip the Band-Aid off, it's just everyone is just kind of purging all of this bile that they've been forced to stuff down. When I say everyone, I mean mostly women comics. And, you know, you as men, it's like, you can't be surprised, you know, when men consistently ignore the egregious offenders in our midst, which I am guilty of, like anybody. I certainly don't know anybody who has done anything illegal that I wouldn't have called out, but there's certainly comedians who say shit on podcasts that I think is not cool, or have associations that I think are really shitty, or I just think that they're crappy people. But, you know, we're comedians, we're in the club. There's a sort of keep the herd happy mentality when you're in the club.
It's not a corporate atmosphere. There's no HR, which is partially, you know, why people get away with things. But you're describing a situation or an atmosphere where it's not normal. People, there's alcohol, there's drugs. People do and say things, and it's a male-dominated, obviously, business and industry. And so the behavior is different than it would be, say, you know, compared to where I was at SiriusXM, you know.
Of course. And also, it's like, you know how it is at a comedy club. The other comedians that are on, there's a table that everybody's sitting at. And so you sit down and you're, you know, yeah, sure, if you wanted, you could flip over the table and raise holy hell every time somebody walked in that had an offensive act to you, or somebody who's just that you thought was a bit of a scumbag. But it's not realistic to exist as a comedian and just create fights every time you're in the room with somebody. But I think sometimes I've definitely been guilty of maybe not making my feelings known when I've heard somebody say something that I thought was shitty, or, you know, like when Cosby, I remember the one time that I clearly did, I was at Dangerfields, which is, I'll just say it, it's the worst club in the country. I don't know, certainly in New York. And
how dare you?
I probably will never be booked there again for saying that, but it is when I say it's the worst, I mean, in terms of how it treats women. They very rarely book women. I think there's one woman who's been performing there for about 30 years. And I think she's the only woman I've ever seen perform there. And all the bartenders and the regulars just sit around and talk shit about women all the time. And when the Cosby thing was happening, that, you know, there's 3 guys just all going, oh, they all want to be stars, they all want to be famous. And I just lost it on them. You know, it's like, why the fuck do you think women don't come forward? And somehow I was the asshole in that situation because, hey, we're all just having fun. What are you bringing us down for? You know, and so I have been guilty of not sticking up for women in contexts like that because I don't want to upset the herd. And so we're all trying to navigate it. Like you said, it's not a corporate environment. People are drinking. People are trying to sort of be edgy for the sake of a joke. You know, comedians are always trying to one up each other. And so, you know, it's not a simple solution, but I think when something like this Crystalia thing happens, it brings up a lot of little and big wounds that women in our industry have to suffer on a day-to-day basis.
The other thing that surfaced this week was the podcast episode where Joe Rogan had Joey Diaz. I guess this was from a couple of years ago, but it resurfaced. Somebody brought it out where Joey Diaz was just talking about how he made women perform oral sex on him before they could go on stage at I think it was the Comedy Store in L.A. And the problem was Joe Rogan, and who was the other guy on that? I don't.
Brian Redban is his name. I don't know what his last name is.
They laughed, or they certainly didn't say that was wrong. And it was weird because I was sitting there and I was in a conversation with. I was like, would I have said something? Have I been in that situation and said something? And I was like, I think I would. I think I would say if someone was saying that I wouldn't let someone on stage unless they suck my dick, I think I would say that that's really weird thing for you to do. That's a very horrible thing, but I don't know. But the point is, Rogan is getting a lot of grief, and I think rightfully so for not handling that, for not rejecting that.
Well, cultivating that for years. That podcast I believe was a few years ago. I assume it was a few years ago because the studio that it was recorded in was much more bare bones than his sort of fancy schmancy studio that he has now. So I assume it was in the early days of the podcast before it fully took off. But when Joe Rogan said something positive about Bernie Sanders and the Bernie campaign put out that endorsement on Twitter, a lot of people were really upset about that. And a lot of the Bernie supporters were like, come on, guys, like we need to make allies with people. We can't just cut off people because we think they're bros or whatever, that we have to find common ground. And I don't know what the right answer is, but clips like this Joey Diaz thing point to me. This is why it is not cool to just, do we really want to form an alliance with every single person? You know what I mean? Like at a certain point, like, are you willing to sell down the river, women, gays, trans, because Joe Rogan said a lot of anti-transsexual things, transgender rather, where what sort of alliances do you want to make, and where do you draw the line?
I think the thing though is also not like, I'm not sure what Rogan has said. I just know, more importantly, the people that he has had on and the way he hasn't necessarily always challenged them. And I think he's a complicated guy. He's been really good to me. It makes it harder for me to criticize him. But I think the issue becomes, and we could talk about someone like Steve Bannon. When you are talking to someone and they say something racist or anti-Semitic or really sexist, and you laugh or you don't say anything, and it's on tape, it makes you look bad. You're complicit in that. And I'm always reminded of when Steve Bannon worked at SiriusXM, and I was the show after his, so I'd always catch the end of his show. I'd always see him every day, which is such a bizarre thing that I worked right next to Steve Bannon in the same studio. But what he would do a lot, Christian, is that someone would call in and they would say something horrific, really anti-Semitic, something about the Jews run the media, whatever. He wouldn't push back. He would say, thanks for the call. When you allow someone, Andrew Schultz, who's on Joe Rogan's show, going off on transsexuals right away, he's like, I hope CNN picks this up, just for the sake of being controversial. And he allows for it and doesn't push back. And I'm not saying he always does. I think he does push back.
That's the whole business model, though. I mean, that's people don't listen to Joe Rogan because they think he's funny. I'm telling you, I'm not saying he's not funny. I'm just saying that that's not the itch that is scratched by Joe Rogan and by a whole fleet
on that podcast.
Yeah, by a whole fleet of podcasts. It's you're saying the thing that they're telling me we're not allowed to say. It's that catharsis of like, you said I can't do it. Look at me, I'm doing it anyway. That is way more important than some, really hilarious take he has on Dixie, on Dixie cups or, 4th of July or whatever.
Yeah. The other dynamic is the power dynamic. So when it's Joe Rogan talking to a lesser known comedian, that comedian isn't as likely to challenge him. Or when it's your supervisor at work doing something, you're less likely to challenge him because they're your supervisor. But I thought it was interesting watching Bill Burr on with Joe Rogan, and Rogan was basically saying masks are for pussies, and Bill went really hard against that. It's like, why would you say such a thing? But it's only when someone is as influential and powerful, not only, but often as the person they're talking to, that they stand up for what they believe in. It's a power thing so often for people. They're afraid to speak up.
And it's the only reason Rogan allowed it. You know, I imagine that it's like if somebody lesser than Bill Burr was saying that exact same stuff, he probably would have gone in on him hard, and all of his fans would start, you know,
well, that's what happened to me.
Him. That's what happened to you. I mean, it's funny because that's exactly what
Joe
happened.
And I argued for 3 hours, and he came off actually sounding like the more reasonable, mature person, because actually Joe is like a very calm tempered person, and I'm like temperamental and pitchy, and my tone was
it's also a home game. It's a home game for him.
Yeah. But
he knows that everyone listening already supports him. You know what I mean?
But I did get beat up for 3 months, and still I get, emails about the gun argument that we were having. But nonetheless, most people just don't stand up at, forget about Joe and entertainment, but even in their companies, because they're afraid. They're afraid to say what they believe because of the consequences. Every business is a small world, and this is going to stay with you forever. And so I'm not sure always what the answer is, because people live with that fear of having their entire career destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little rich for me to hear people who are on the right, or at least on the edgelord right, complain about free speech when they will organize like a herd of, a fleet of hornets around anyone who disagrees with anything they say, and bludgeon that person, into silence. Just, they wield their lack of social life like a weapon.
That happened to me last week with Dan Bongino's crowd too.
Oh, absolutely. I have 6 hours to harass you all, for the next 6 weeks. Every night, I'm going to just spend my day bothering you. I
had a guy, this is my fault a little bit, but I challenged Dan Bongino and all of his supporters to fight me for
a swollen head contest.
To have an uglier head contest. I said, we'll raise money for charity. Who wants to fight or something? And it was so preposterous that I was sure everybody knew that I would not fight. Some guy created a Twitter account just to fight Pete Dominick, June 20th. He pinged me every day up until June 20th. And then the day after, when I didn't show up for the fight, he went off on me. And to your point, he spent a week and a half bludgeoning me, creating a Twitter account, Pete Dominick fight, June 20th in some park. And he spent so much time coming for me. It was almost like that's all the guy was going to do. I was flattered, but also thought it was pretty sad, pathetic, and scary.
These people they're sad people. And I think it's important that we remember that, and it kind of segs right into one of the other things we were going to talk about is this Parler, however they're pronouncing it, this new app.
Hollywood Reporter headline: I'm done. Right-wing personalities ditching Twitter for Parler over claims of censorship. An app that's apparently similar to Twitter. I'd never heard of it, called Parler, and maybe I shouldn't even plug it anymore by spelling it, but whatever. Billed as a free speech alternative to big tech. A number of big names in conservative media have touted this social network, including Donald Trump Jr., Candace Owens, Dan Bongino, I just mentioned, Rudy Giuliani, and the great Alex Jones. They're fed up with the censorship and the political bias, Christian.
Yeah. First of all, it's not censorship if it's not done by the government. So fuck off. First of all, it's not censorship. But it's hilarious to me. They tried this a few years ago with Gab, and Gab never took off. God, who knows why, but that was another Twitter rival. There's a fatal flaw in their reasoning, though, and that is that it doesn't work without liberals. That these people, their entire existence is based on trolling and about starting fights or observing other people own lives. And so they can go off and do their own thing, but they cannot survive without the host body. They are parasitic by nature. And so their whole thing is about crashing parties. Oh, you're having a party? I'm going to crash it and ruin it. Yeah. Well, then you can't be like, hey, everybody come over to my house for a party. It's like, no. And so it's like a bunch of vampires threatening to isolate themselves from human beings. It's like, okay, go ahead. Let me know how that works.
You love your metaphors because they're so apt. And that is such a perfect one to explain this. But, you say it's not censorship if it's not from the government. I mean, you can go out and scream whatever you want. You can hold up a Nazi flag on the corner if you want. There's all kinds of crazy things that you can do or say, and it's not against the law. But you can't do them in my establishment. You can't do them on my website. You can't do them at this school. You can't. Those are the rules. And furthermore, you got to wear a mask. If you want to come in here, you can't yell the N-word and you can't not wear a mask. Those are our rules. And if you don't like them, fine, but get out. That's what Twitter should be, and to some extent is saying. And I mean,
they've tried to kind of play both sides of it for the last 5 years or so. Since Trump started to rise, they've been trying to sort of maintain this air that, hey, we're just a utility like the phone company. Like, we can't be held responsible for what people use phones for. We're just a phone company. But at the same time, they are a private company. They have stockholders, and they have, but getting back to a second ago to just the whole Parler thing is, they're not interested in really talking to each other at the end of the day. They want to retweet each other, but really what they want to do is retweet each other slamming libs, owning libs. That's really the only reason that they exist. And without that, if you've noticed, all these people who are talking about leaving Twitter, none of them have actually left Twitter. They're saying, well, I'm going to continue to post here on Twitter, but I'm going to go over to Parler. It's like, okay, so you're not really leaving Twitter at all. You're trying to threaten Twitter with this idea that there's going to be some mass exodus from Twitter, and that's going to, hurt Twitter in the pocketbook. Well, not really, because you're not really a desirable financial demographic. Twitter doesn't make a lot of money selling stuff to Russian bots and old people.
Would you describe that liberals or progressive-minded Twitter users use it differently and for different purposes than simply dunking on? Because, liberals do a lot of trolling and a lot of similar behaviors as conservatives. What do you think is the difference here?
Well, first of all, I'll say we. That's a pretty broad we. Obviously, I don't agree with everybody that's on my side of things politically or whatever, but we all seem to make it work without violating terms of service. Somehow we manage to not, and when people who are ostensibly allies of mine do get yanked off Twitter, like the Krasensteins, like those idiots, those, liberal grifters, those guys they were one of those sort of the people that would just post, the Krasenstein brothers. They were like basically these liberal grifters, resistance grifters, who would post on Twitter all the time. And eventually Twitter yanked them down. It's like, all right, you're just clearly trying to, make money off of this.
The thing that I get, the way they explain it, the way I understand it is, well, you say liberals, generally we don't get banned. We don't get in trouble. And I think that's because generally we're not, you said breaking the terms of agreement. And here's the thing that they'll say, you're targeting conservatives. And I would say, no, their rules are against sexism or racism or violence or certain types of behavior. And the problem is those are overwhelmingly thoughts and behaviors of people on the right. So you can say that they're targeting us, but the truth is, no, anybody, if you're a liberal and you say this or that, then you're going down too. But they're generally not, because we generally don't believe those things, or at least we try not to. We might not always practice it, but we try not to. So what do you say, Christian, when they say they're targeting conservative speech, not liberal speech? Because I say, no, they're targeting racism or threats of violence or doxing or hardcore sexism. That's what they're targeting. It just so happens you're the ones doing it.
I would say what a disgustingly low bar you have for what's considered conservative. That if you think that this is targeting conservatism, that's pretty revealing on what you think conservative means. And it's pretty sad, especially compared to even a generation ago, what being conservative meant. Even when I have never agreed with conservatives about much of anything, I at least thought it was a coherent belief system that had a perspective on the world, and that many, at least half of true conservatives out there, believed what they thought and had a general love of America and wanted to see Americans succeed. These aren't these people. If you ban me from Twitter because I'm propositioning 16-year-old girls, it's like, and then I was like, well, you're targeting me because of my beliefs. It's like, no, we allow certain things and we don't allow certain things. And what you're doing falls outside of those.
Your beliefs are under targeting underage girls. That's what our problem is. It's not.
Yeah.
It's that. It's not what you wear.
And you know what? And they're completely within their rights to be like, you know what? Twitter clearly doesn't want us. We're going to go off and do our own thing. And to them, I say, try it.
Good luck.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Good luck.
They're not going anywhere. There's too much of an audience on Twitter and Facebook, which is different. We could talk about them as well. We also want to talk about the fact that this week, that Tuesday, it was primary day. And I think, I don't know, there have been other states that maybe haven't gotten as much of attention. Obviously, Georgia did because of the voter suppression that we saw play out. That was a big deal. Then I think Pennsylvania happened recently. Once once the nominee is selected, the primaries get less attention. But this week was a pretty big deal because it was New York State and it was Kentucky. And the race in Kentucky got a lot of attention because it was the race to take on Mitch McConnell. In New York, we saw the wins where I live in District 17, where I thought for an hour and a half about running for Congress, which sounds so crazy right now to even say out loud that I was even considering that, especially since the people who did run were pretty impressive. The guy who won is Mondaire Jones. He's black. He's gay. Went to Harvard. He grew up poor in this district. And he's very progressive, endorsed by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, so on. You saw a long time, I think he was there since 1989, Elliot Engel lose his primary to a black guy who's a former principal of a high school and a progressive guy. And you saw other outcomes as well that were progressives being elected, in the kind of image of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because we're talking about the House mainly here, and her endorsement obviously matter. What's going on here, and is it a good thing?
I think it's an amazing thing. I think it's wonderful and well needed, specifically in New York, that, you have what is considered to be the one of, if not the most liberal city in the country. And yet its elected representatives for the past generation have been as mainstream gets. And they've been, I would say, as much an obstacle to progress as, as allies to progress. That they're sort of barnacles politically. And you're starting to see, when AOC won in 2018, a lot of people ascribed that to her sort of new car smell, the bright new shiny face, the shiny object or whatever. And she was always very clear that, that no, people want change. They're sick of representatives that they never see in their district. They're ready for more progressive policies that there's an energy on the streets politically that has not yet arrived in Washington, or at least is starting to now. But they kind of thought, I think for since I've been a little kid, the sort of blue dog vein of the Democratic Party have treated the left as sort of gadflies, as sort of, they would sort of pat them on the head and send them on their way.
Well said.
And no longer. I mean, she was very clear. It's, that this is not a me thing. You're going to see it, that other candidates like me, I mean, I'm paraphrasing wildly, but this to me is just sort of, she was kind of the canary in the coal mine. And I think you're going to see this spread to other races around the country. And I think it's something that has been needed. As Democrats, we tend to focus way too much on the presidential race, and we're kind of blindsided by how much political power is held by council people and governors and mayors and state senators and things like that. And it feels like the left in general has kind of finally gotten wise to that. And I think it's super exciting. Even if a particular candidate here and there might fall to the left of me, who cares? There's this idea among Democrats sometimes that it's like a lot of Democrats seem more willing to accept someone to the right of them than to the left of them. That Democrats all seem to think that, like, well, nobody's as liberal as me, so I better compromise with people who are more conservative than I am. No, like not enough Democrats think, you know what, maybe I should compromise with people who are a little more radical than I am, that maybe that's where the energy is headed. And that's the kind of energy that gets people out to vote. And sort of it speaks to the actual problems that young people are facing over the next 20 years, that the problems that a 32-year-old is looking at for their future are very different than the problems somebody like Elliot Engel would know what to do with. And so to me, it's a real cleansing. It's and people say, oh, it's like the Tea Party. Well, not really. The Tea Party replaced its moderates with sort of old cranky people.
The Tea Party replaces moderates with extremely terrifying people who believe in the craziest things that you can't even imagine writing into a movie. Like you can't imagine JFK Jr. is alive, and he is going to be, that's who replaced the quote moderate Republicans. But I also
sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's do it again one more time. The idea of patting the head, I love what you just said there. Just patting the head of the progressive, and I think of that head being a minority, a black or brown person or a woman. That Democrats just kind of, we're still catering to wealthier white folks for years and years and years, and I think that's changed a tremendous amount as black and brown people and women have gotten more power, and gays have got more power and more seats at the table to influence things. And I think, I'm not worried about Joe Biden being progressive. Not at all. He is he's probably going to be the most progressive president we ever had if he wins. He has to be. He's going to have to be. And he's going to want to be. I'm not worried about his past votes and his past record, because I don't think it's about him. I think he knows who he's got to answer to get things done. And it's a more progressive party, period. I'm not concerned.
And the more Jamal Bowman's and Mondaire Jones's and AOC's, and the AOC thing specifically, this woman who ran against her in the primary was a Republican CNBC anchor, Michelle Caruso Cabrera, who wrote a book a few years ago called I'm Right, Small Government and whatever, just straight up, Wall Street Republican book. And then she tried to promote herself as a Democrat to run against AOC. And from what I can tell, a lot of people seem to really think that she had a chance to unseat AOC, because I think that these dummies, these people out there, they don't understand why she resonates with people.
Right. Yeah.
They do not understand that when she talks, she is verbalizing things that a lot of people feel, and these are not the people that they interact with.
The same reason that a lot of pundits, to some extent, including myself, didn't give Trump's message credit. No one can believe that. They're not going to buy that. Oh yeah, watch. And enough people did.
I hate to make them equivalent, but I do take your point.
Well, yeah, no, but it's okay.
I know what you mean, though. They resonate, for better or for worse.
Two more quick things, if we can, Christian. One of which is this week, the president basically started talking about, this in his speech actually last weekend, and he's been asked about it a couple times, slowing down the testing. If we had less tests, we'd see less cases. And it's just such a fundamental example of how horrible his handling and reaction to the worst pandemic in generations has been. You look at the rest of the world and how they've handled things, and no one has handled it perfectly because people don't know how. Governments don't know how. Institutions, this is new, and we don't understand this disease. But this president has taken the most fundamental advice and thrown it in the garbage. And it's just, I don't know what the question is to you or anybody outside of how frighteningly depressing it is that he has been such a miserable failure as a reaction to this disease. Completely ignored all the science about it, just like hurricanes and everything else. And it's gotten worse on his watch as a result. And do you think we'll see anything different from state governments and state leadership that are still paying fealty to him?
Well, and yeah, 3 years of abdicating responsibility of throwing the fight because it's just not worth having. Trump says something ridiculous. They give a little lip service to that's not how I would have phrased it, or I didn't read the tweet or whatever. Basically, they just want it to go away because they think that, we'll get judges and we'll get all these things that we want out of Trump. Well, now now the chickens are officially coming home to roost, because when you empower somebody like Trump to think that, that he can do whatever he wants, he does do whatever he wants. And what he wants is for people to like him. I don't think it's any more complicated than that. Or certain people to like him. He wants. It's maddening. And as you see the trend lines in the United States diverge from the rest of the world and go up, other than places like Brazil, which is also ruled by run by a semi-fascist government. You start to. My only hope is that now that the truth is sort of laid bare by plain statistics, when we watch the EU being able to reopen and we can't, and they're not allowing us to travel because we're now pariahs.
We're finally exceptional.
Yeah. My only hope is that there's a lot of people, and I don't think they're going to say it out loud, but even a lot of Trump supporters, I think, not the QAnon idiots, but just sort of the sort of Joe Sixpack Trump supporter, they might talk a good game, but I think they're kind of secretly hoping that Trump loses.
I hope you're right about that. Before we let you go, this weekend, the venue that your wife owns in Queens, QED, is opening back up for a live performance. You're doing an outdoor live performance this weekend. And, in general, where are we at with live performance and how do you feel about heading back out there this weekend?
I don't know. I mean, we're not doing it as a real financial plan. We're only selling like 20 tickets and all the seats are going to be 6 feet apart. It's, I imagine, going to feel slightly awkward. It's going to be out in the backyard. We're sort of transforming it into a venue, but I'm hoping that there'll be a warmth and enthusiasm just for people to kind of be in each other's presence again, even at a distance, just to sort of remind ourselves that there is a community of people out there and that live performance does bring people together in a way that very little else does. And so we're hoping that it is, for lack of a better word, spiritually enriching, even more so on obviously the finances are important and we want that to eventually become part of the equation as well. But this is just kind of, New York is entering phase 2. And so everything we're doing is completely in accordance with what guidelines are. And my wife spends 8 hours a day navigating, she was just on a Zoom webinar with our state senator about, Q&A about what phase 2 means and what you can do and what you can't do. And so there's going to be some hoops that audience members have to jump through, but I think we all kind of understand that's like, this is sort of a proof of concept type thing where let's try to take our first dip into what the new normal might be. And,
I really
works.
I wish you were live streaming it because I kind of want to watch, how it goes for you.
Our plans are probably not on Saturday just because it's our first time. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of moving parts. And we want to make sure we kind of do it properly first. Yeah. But the plan is to live stream them. Because theoretically, there'll be at least a couple of shows every weekend from here on out.
If you want it to be technically fucked, I'll come produce it. Because I'm known to fail lately. Thank you very much for joining me. Good luck this weekend. I look forward to hearing how it goes next week when we talk, hopefully. And thanks as always, pal. Always great. And a lot of great, awesome commentary here today. I always learn stuff when I talk to you. I love your point of view. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Pete.
All right.
All right, that is at Christ Finnegan. I love that guy and always love when he joins me, which is almost every Friday. That's it, folks. That is the 5th and final show of the week.
I'll be on MSNBC Sunday night at 9 East.
I'm on every day here, so these podcasts almost always drop by 4 a.m. Almost always. I almost never miss it, and I'm really happy about that consistency and the quality. We've got great guests this week, so many good guests this week. And I'm looking forward to next week as well. Tell me who you want to hear. I've gotten some great guest suggestions. I taped with Jeff Charlotte, had an awesome conversation. That was thanks to a listener suggesting that, and so many other folks are suggesting people. Who would you like to hear? Don't forget, I can't do this show every day without your paid subscriptions. If you haven't signed up, we got about 15 new subscribers this week alone. Really excited about that. Would love to have you sign up today or over the weekend. Always great to wake up to new subscriptions. So sign up. Paid subscription link in the show notes, patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And remember, you're not alone. As I told you, I had a pretty rough day today. Maybe you did too. We can commiserate. Let me know. I hope to hear from you next week. We'll do a listener show and a listener get together. Looking forward to that with all my subscribers. Love you guys. And I'll talk to you next week.